The galaxy was vast and filled with countless species, many of whom had never even made contact with each other. Some civilizations had existed for millennia, their technology and wisdom far beyond that of others. But even the most advanced species could be caught off guard. It was an era of peace, or so it seemed, until the unexpected happened. The first sign came from the most unlikely of places, a small, forgotten planet located in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. The planet, once a thriving hub for trade and culture, had faded into obscurity over the centuries. Its inhabitants, the Lyrians, were a peaceful race known for their remarkable scientific advancements. Yet, despite their technological brilliance, the Lyrians had always depended on others for protection. They had grown complacent, unprepared for the dangers lurking in the vastness of space. The distress signal came in a burst of static, the Lyrian language barely decipherable at first. It was a message of desperation, not just from one individual but from the entire planet. Their message spoke of a planet in crisis. An ancient weapon buried deep within their world had begun to destabilize the very core of their planet. The weapon, a relic of an old war, had been dormant for centuries. But now it was awakening. With each passing moment, the planet's future grew bleaker. The Lyrians explained that they had no idea how to stop the weapon. Their technology, once the envy of the galaxy, was no longer capable of dealing with the threat. The planet's surface was already showing signs of cracking under the strain, and violent storms had begun to erupt across the skies. If they didn't find a way to stop it, the planet would be destroyed, and with it, an entire species. The message was short but filled with urgency. The Lyrians begged for help, asking for anyone capable of saving them. But the truth was that few in the galaxy cared for the Lyrians. Their species was no longer a force to be reckoned with, and many had long since forgotten their importance. The galaxy had moved on. But in the darkest corners of space, there were always those who responded to the call of distress. Those who were feared, respected, and strangely admired. They were known as the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were a group of races from planets where survival was not a luxury, but a constant struggle. Their worlds were hostile, filled with dangerous creatures, extreme environments, and deadly conditions. On these worlds, only the strongest survived. It was said that the Deathworlders could withstand anything: poisonous atmospheres, acid rains, firestorms, and creatures that could tear even the strongest of them apart. They had adapted to survive and thrive in places that would break others. The galaxy had long heard tales of the Deathworlders' strength and resolve, but few had ever seen them in action. The Deathworlders were known to keep to themselves, rarely venturing out into the galaxy. But when the distress signal from the Lyrians reached their ears, something changed. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was an opportunity, one that the Deathworlders could not ignore. Commander Valen, leader of the Deathworlder fleet, was the first to hear the Lyrian signal. He was a towering figure, a warrior with scars from countless battles fought on hostile worlds. His ship, the Wraith, was a symbol of his people's strength, equipped with technology far beyond what the Lyrians could even imagine. Valen had heard of the Lyrians, but he had never expected to be called upon to help them. Unlike many of the more civilized races in the galaxy, Valen didn't see a reason to hesitate. The Deathworlders were not bound by the same diplomatic rules and fears that others followed. They lived for one thing: survival. They knew that sometimes, even the most unlikely of alliances could change the fate of entire worlds. Without wasting time, Valen gathered his fleet, a group of ships made up of his own people, the Xaranthians and the Terek. The Xaranthians were a fierce, insectoid species with an unmatched ability to fight in swarms, while the Terek were massive, armored beings who could withstand almost any kind of damage. Together, they formed a formidable force, ready to face whatever danger lay ahead. The fleet set course for the Lyrian system. As they traveled through the black void of space, the Deathworlders felt no fear. They had faced worse. The journey, however, was long, and the tension grew as the fleet approached the Lyrian planet. They had no idea what awaited them. The Lyrians had said little about the weapon or the situation beyond the distress signal. The Deathworlders knew only one thing. They had a chance to save a species from extinction, and they would do whatever it took to succeed. As the fleet entered the Lyrian system, the planet came into view. The once beautiful world was now surrounded by swirling storms, and there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. The Deathworlders did not hesitate. They prepared their ships for landing, ready to face whatever challenges the planet had in store for them. The Deathworlders were not saviors by choice. They were survivors. And in this moment, survival meant saving an entire species, or watching it fall into ruin. The Lyrian planet loomed ahead, a world once full of life, now twisted and scourged by the deadly force that threatened to destroy it. As Commander Valen stood on the bridge of the Wraith, his ship cutting through the void of space toward the doomed world, he felt a familiar sense of purpose. The Deathworlders had always thrived in chaos and danger. To them, it was just another challenge, another fight for survival. The fleet moved in formation, sleek and intimidating ships of varying sizes and shapes. Each vessel was designed for one thing: war. The Deathworlders didn't need the flashy luxury ships that some other species preferred. No, their ships were tools, built for practicality and strength. The Wraith, the flagship of the fleet, was the largest and most powerful of them all. Its dark, angular shape made it look almost like a shadow in the stars. Around it, a dozen other ships, including those of the Teranthians and the Terric, followed in perfect coordination. The Lyrians had sent their distress signal only days ago, but the Deathworlders had responded without hesitation. The Lyrians had hoped for a miracle, but they had no idea who was coming to their aid. To them, the Deathworlders were just legends, tales told in hushed voices, spoken of in fearful awe by those who had heard of their battles. Yet these very legends were about to become reality. As the Wraith entered the Lyrian system, the view of the planet became clearer. The surface was a patchwork of storms and lightning, with the once pristine oceans now turning black from the growing instability. The atmosphere itself seemed to churn with energy, the electromagnetic fields disturbed by the power of the weapon buried deep within the planet's core. "Prepare to land." Valen's deep voice echoed through the ship. The crew, accustomed to his calm and commanding presence, moved swiftly to carry out their tasks. The Deathworlders had faced worse situations before. No storm, no weapon, and no enemy could make them falter. The Lyrians were waiting for them, down on the surface. Valen had received their coordinates, and now his fleet was preparing to make contact. As they entered the planet's atmosphere, the small ships broke away from the main fleet, each one heading for a different landing zone. The Lyrians had cleared a landing strip for the Deathworlders, though Valen could tell they were nervous. The Lyrians had always been a peaceful people, and the sight of the imposing Deathworlder fleet must have been overwhelming. The first wave of Deathworlder soldiers, armed with high-tech weapons and survival gear, descended onto the surface, their ships cutting through the storm clouds. Valen led the charge, his team landing in a desolate part of the planet, where the winds howled and the ground cracked beneath their feet. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, an omen of what was to come. As the Deathworlders disembarked, they were met by a group of Lyrian officials, dressed in their ceremonial robes. They were a race known for their elegance, their sharp minds, and their advanced technology. But now they looked frail and unsure. Their once proud world was on the brink of collapse, and they were desperate for answers. "Welcome, Commander Valen," one of the Lyrians, a tall, slender figure named Rethan, spoke. His voice was filled with gratitude, but it also carried a sense of fear. We never expected this kind of help." Valen nodded, his expression unreadable. "You called for help. We came. Now we deal with the problem." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The Deathworlders knew better than anyone that in times of crisis, every second mattered. Rethan and his team led Valen, and his soldiers through the ruined city, which had once been a marvel of Lyrian architecture. Now it was a shadow of its former self, abandoned and crumbling under the stress of the ongoing storms. The devastation was evident: torn buildings, shattered roads, and the overwhelming sense that the planet was dying. The weapon, Valen muttered under his breath. He had seen worlds fall before, but there was something different about this one. The Lyrians had failed to stop it, but they had underestimated the Deathworlder's ability to adapt and fight. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a relic from an ancient war, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Rethan spoke again, his voice low. The weapon was buried deep beneath the city. It was a safeguard, a last-ditch defense against invaders. But it's not just the weapon we're worried about anymore. The storms, the instability, everything is collapsing. Valen's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. And you think we can stop it? We believe you can, Rethan said, his tone filled with a mix of hope and desperation. You're our last chance. Valen didn't respond immediately. He wasn't one for empty promises, but he knew the stakes. The Deathworlders weren't known for failing, and he didn't plan to start now. They had the strength, the cunning, and the willpower to survive whatever was thrown their way. He turned to his team. Move out. Find the weapon. Prepare for anything. The team moved swiftly, their bodies honed from years of surviving on Deathworlds. The air was thick, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath them, but nothing fazed them. They were Deathworlders, and no planet, no weapon, and no enemy could break their spirit. As they made their way toward the heart of the city, the skies above darkened even further, the storms growing more intense. It was clear that the weapon was close, and with each step, they could feel the power emanating from it, like the pulse of a dying world. But the Deathworlders didn't hesitate. They were here to do what needed to be done, and they would fight to the very end to save the Lyrians, or see them fall. The Deathworlder fleet descended through the Lyrian atmosphere like shadows in the sky. The vast clouds, darkened by the fierce electromagnetic storms brewing above the surface, parted as the fleet's ships punched through them, their descent steady and controlled despite the chaos surrounding them. For most, the sight of such storms would be terrifying. For the Deathworlders, however, it was just another challenge to overcome. Commander Valen stood at the helm of the Wraith, eyes fixed on the planet below. His mind raced through plans, calculations, and contingency strategies. He had fought in battles across countless worlds, but this was something different. This wasn't a foreign enemy he could conquer with brute force. This was an entire planet in distress, its very core on the brink of destruction. The stakes were high, and failure wasn't an option. As the fleet made its final descent, the Lyrian planet came into full view. Once, it had been a beautiful world, a place of vibrant ecosystems and thriving cities. Now it was scared and twisted by the weapon buried deep within its heart. The electromagnetic disturbances from the weapon had caused massive damage, frying communications, creating violent weather patterns, and destabilizing the planet's crust. Valen's ship made contact with the surface first, its landing gear touching down with a soft thud on the cracked, uneven ground. The storm outside raged, its wind howling and lightning flashing across the sky in violent streaks. It was a harsh welcome, but the Deathworlders were undeterred. They disembarked quickly, prepared for whatever lay ahead. The Deathworlder soldiers, equipped in dark combat armor, moved swiftly. Their eyes were alert, scanning the surrounding area as they formed a secure perimeter. Despite the harsh environment, they had no fear. The air was thick with a strange metallic scent, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The Lyrian city they had landed in was eerily quiet, the once bustling streets now empty and filled with debris. Buildings stood in ruins, their once proud structures reduced to piles of broken stone and twisted metal. Commander Valen's gaze swept over the ruined city. It was clear that the Lyrians had once been a powerful and advanced civilization, but the devastation around him spoke volumes. The planet had been on the edge for too long. Their technology, once capable of incredible feats, was no longer enough to stop the force they had unleashed. Rethan, the Lyrian leader who had greeted Valen earlier, approached cautiously. His people were visibly shaken, their faces drawn with worry. It was clear that they had placed all their hopes on the Deathworlders, and now it was up to them to save the planet. "We've tried everything we can," Rethan said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But it's too late for us. The weapon, it's more powerful than we realized. We can't stop it." Valen didn't offer any empty promises. He understood the gravity of the situation. The Lyrians had made a critical mistake. They had relied too much on technology to solve their problems, and now that same technology was threatening to end them. "Tell me everything," Valen said, his voice calm but firm. "Where is the weapon? Where did you hide it?" Rethan nodded, his face pale. "The weapon is buried deep beneath the city, in the ancient ruins. We thought it was a failsafe, a last-ditch measure, in case of a galaxy-wide invasion. But it wasn't meant to be used like this. We've lost control of it." Valen turned to his team, signaling for them to move forward. "Lead us to it. We don't have much time." The Lyrians led the way, walking through the devastated city with the Deathworlders in tow. As they moved deeper into the ruins, the signs of damage became more apparent. The ground was cracked open in places, as if the very earth beneath their feet was beginning to break apart. The skies above churned, the electromagnetic storms growing more intense with each passing moment. It was clear that the planet was on the brink of collapse. Along the way, Rethan spoke of the Lyrian history, of their once glorious civilization, and of the weapon that had been created centuries ago. It was a massive ancient device, designed to be the ultimate defense against any external threats. But the weapon's power had been miscalculated, and now it was growing unstable, drawing energy from the very core of the planet. The Lyrians had tried to contain it, but their technology was insufficient. "We should have destroyed it," Rethan muttered, guilt and regret thick in his voice. "We should have known better." Commander Valen didn't offer any words of comfort. He didn't need to. The Deathworlders understood that regret didn't fix anything. Action was what mattered now. Finally, they reached the entrance to the ancient ruins, a dark and foreboding place, filled with shadows and silence. The temperature dropped noticeably as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with strange, unfamiliar markings, symbols that had long since lost their meaning to the Lyrians. As they moved deeper into the ruins, the sounds of the storm above seemed to fade. The weapon was close now, its presence palpable. The Deathworlders could feel it, an oppressive force, growing stronger with each step they took. Whatever this weapon was, it was more than just a device. It was a force of nature, a creature of power that had once been dormant, but was now awakening. "This is it," Rethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's down below, in the heart of the ruins." Valen nodded. "Prepare yourselves," he ordered, his tone hard and focused. "We don't know what we're facing down there, but we're going to stop it." The team descended into the depths of the ancient city, ready for whatever challenge awaited them. The planet's fate rested in their hands now. And though the storm above raged, and the ground beneath them trembled, the Deathworlders stood unshaken, their resolve as unbreakable as ever. They had come to fight, not for glory, but for survival. And they would not fail. The further they ventured into the ruins, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew heavier, thick with an ancient, almost unnatural energy that seemed to pulse through the walls and floor. The Deathworlders' boots echoed in the silence as they moved deeper into the darkened depths, the only light coming from the glow of their helmets and weapons. Commander Valen led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. His soldiers followed closely behind, moving in perfect formation, accustomed to the dangers of hostile environments. The Lyrians, on the other hand, were visibly anxious. They had never set foot in these ruins before, and the eerie quietness of the place unnerved them. The ancient symbols etched into the walls flickered faintly, as though responding to the energy in the air. The deeper they went, the more it felt as if the ruins themselves were alive. Rethan, the Lyrian leader, walked beside Valen, his face grim. "I never imagined I would see this place," he murmured. "These ruins are older than our records. The weapon, it was created before our time." Valen nodded. "And now it's your undoing." Rethan flinched but said nothing. The weight of his words hung in the air like a cloud, thick with the understanding that this weapon, once meant for protection, had turned into something far worse. The Deathworlders had seen weapons like this before, ancient and forgotten, created in times of desperation. And each time, it had ended in catastrophe. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The walls were smooth stone, but every few steps, they encountered jagged cracks that seemed to vibrate with an eerie hum. The ground beneath them shifted slightly, a constant reminder that the planet was teetering on the edge of destruction. The storm above raged louder, the electromagnetic pulses growing stronger as they approached the weapon's location. They finally reached a large chamber, its entrance marked by ancient carvings that depicted a strange and long-lost civilization. The symbols were unfamiliar, even to Rethan, but they shared a common theme of destruction and rebirth. The chamber beyond was dark, the only illumination coming from the strange, glowing blue light emanating from deep within the room. As they stepped into the chamber, the air seemed to crackle with energy. The weapon was near. At the center of the room, suspended in a web of energy, was a massive spherical object. It looked ancient, covered in layers of dust and debris, but the strange blue glow was undeniable. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat that was slowly growing louder with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the power it emitted. Rethan's voice was barely a whisper. That is the weapon. It was never meant to be activated, but it has somehow come to life. The energy from its core is causing the storms. The planet's core is destabilizing. If we don't shut it down, everything will be lost." Valen stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the weapon. He could feel the power radiating from it, an immense, raw force that seemed to call out to him. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. These kinds of ancient devices were never designed to be turned off by anyone. The Deathworlders had faced down weapons like this before, ancient technology that could only be neutralized with precision and strength. "We'll need to disable its core," Valen said, his voice steady and commanding. "Everyone, get into position." His team spread out, weapons at the ready, while Valen and Rethan approached the glowing sphere. The energy in the room made it difficult to concentrate. The air crackled with static, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum with the weapon's growing power. The closer they got to it, the more it felt as though the weapon itself was alive, watching them, aware of their every move. "I've never seen anything like this," Rethan muttered, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. "We've studied it for years, but we never understood how it truly worked. There are no records, just theories. It was supposed to be a failsafe, but now—" He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. Valen crouched in front of the weapon, his sharp eyes studying its intricate design. He could feel the pulsating energy from within, could almost hear the hum of power building inside it. "It's drawing too much power from the planet's core," Valen said, speaking mostly to himself. "If we don't stop it soon, it will tear the planet apart." The Deathworlders knew what they had to do, but the task wasn't going to be simple. They needed to access the weapon's core and neutralize it, but that would require getting past its protective layers, a difficult task, given the strength of the energy field surrounding it. Valen turned to his soldiers. "Prepare the EMP devices," he ordered. "We're going to need to overload the energy field to disrupt its core." The soldiers quickly pulled out devices from their packs, setting them up around the perimeter of the room. The devices hummed to life, sending out pulses of energy designed to overload the weapon's power field. Valen glanced at Rethan, who was still watching the weapon with wide eyes. I'm afraid we've already passed the point of no return, Rethan said quietly. If you can't stop it, nothing will. Valen didn't respond. He didn't need to. There was no room for fear or hesitation now. It was time to act. With a final glance at his team, Valen activated the devices, sending a pulse of energy toward the weapon. The room seemed to hold its breath as the pulse hit the weapon's core, sending a shockwave through the air. The glowing sphere flickered, its light dimming for a brief moment. Then, with a massive surge of energy, the weapon's power field crackled violently. For a brief moment, it looked as if they had failed. But then the weapon's core began to pulse slower, the energy gradually dissipating. The room fell into silence, save for the soft hum of the devices. We did it, Valen muttered under his breath. The weapon's power was neutralized, and the planet's core was no longer under threat. Rethan stood in awe, his face filled with relief. You saved us. Valen simply nodded. There was still much to be done. But for now, the planet had been spared. And the Deathworlders had once again proved that survival, no matter the odds, was their specialty. The chamber was silent now. The weapon, once a powerful and threatening force, had been neutralized. Its glow had faded, its hum quieted, and the storm that raged outside had slowly started to subside. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt still, calm, almost peaceful. Yet, Commander Valen knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. There was still much work ahead. He turned to his team, all of them still on high alert, scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The storm outside might have been calming, but the planet was still unstable. The core had been saved for now, but they didn't know how long it would remain stable. They had to act quickly before the planet collapsed completely. We've bought some time, Valen said, his voice low but steady. But we need to leave before the core destabilizes again. Rethan, we'll need your people to help us secure the exit. Rethan nodded, visibly shaken but relieved. Of course, we can guide you back to the surface. The tunnels will take us to the surface fast. Valen led the way, his steps echoing through the ancient ruins as they made their way back toward the exit. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The cracks in the walls seemed less violent, the ground beneath them more stable. Still, Valen couldn't shake the feeling that the planet wasn't out of danger yet. As they reached the surface, they found that the storm had indeed calmed. The sky, once filled with dark clouds and flashing lightning, was now a dull gray, the violent winds reduced to a gentle breeze. But the damage was clear. The city had been all but destroyed, and the land around them was scared from the intense energy surges. Valyrian's beautiful world had been left in ruins. Rethan stepped forward, looking out over the broken landscape. I don't know how we will rebuild, he said softly. So much has been lost. But you saved us. You saved all of us. Valen glanced at the Lyrian leader. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of understanding in his tone. You can rebuild. You'll have the time now. But you have to learn from this. You relied on a weapon to protect you, but it nearly destroyed your world. Don't make the same mistake again. Rethan nodded solemnly. We will learn. We will rebuild. We owe you everything. The Deathworlders stood in silence for a moment, taking in the vast destruction before them. But even as they gazed at the ruined city, they knew that their work wasn't over. There were still many more steps to take to ensure that the weapon never posed a threat again. Valen turned to his team, signaling them to begin setting up a temporary perimeter. The Lyrians needed time to stabilize their planet, but it was important to make sure they weren't vulnerable again. As the Deathworlders worked, the Lyrians began gathering their people, assessing the damage, and organizing their recovery efforts. It was a slow and painful process, but there was hope now. Hope that hadn't been there before the Deathworlder fleet had arrived. The next few days were spent securing the planet, reinforcing weak points in the environment, and ensuring that the power sources scattered across the city weren't a threat. The Deathworlders used their advanced technology to help restore power to key areas, and while it wasn't perfect, it was enough to stabilize the situation. The Lyrians were grateful for every effort, even the smallest ones. During their work, Valen and Rethin often spoke in quiet moments, planning for the future. Valen made it clear that the Deathworlders would not be staying on the planet indefinitely. They had done what they came to do, and now it was up to the Lyrians to rise from the ashes. But Rethin made one request. "Will you teach us? Will you help us rebuild our technology so that we can avoid such a catastrophe in the future?" Valen thought for a moment before answering. "We will teach you what we can, but you must understand that survival is not about technology. It's about knowing when to use it, and when not to. You have to learn to rely on more than just machines." The Lyrians, though shaken, understood. They had seen firsthand the cost of depending too heavily on technology, and the lesson wasn't lost on them. They began working closely with the Deathworlders, learning about survival, resilience, and what it truly meant to be prepared for whatever came their way. As the days passed, the planet began to stabilize. The storms stopped, the electromagnetic pulses faded. The damage, though still present, was no longer worsening. The Lyrians were starting to rebuild their world, piece by piece, slowly and carefully. But they weren't alone. The Deathworlders had shown them a new way forward, one that wasn't just about power, but about balance, respect, and knowing how to adapt to the forces of nature. Valen stood on the edge of the ruined city, gazing out over the horizon. He could feel the tension of the planet's near death still in the air, but he also felt the hope that was slowly growing among the Lyrians. They had a long road ahead of them, but they had survived. And as long as they learned from their mistakes, there was a chance for them to thrive once again. The Deathworlders would leave soon, their mission complete. But they knew they had made a difference. In the end, it wasn't just about fighting and conquering. It was about ensuring that life, in all its forms, could continue. And that was something the Deathworlders understood all too well. As they prepared to leave, Valen looked once more at the peaceful sky above, the storm now nothing more than a distant memory. He turned to his team, giving them a final command before they boarded their ships. "Let's go home." And with that, the Deathworlder fleet began to ascend, leaving the Lyrians to rebuild, to grow, and to never forget the lessons they had learned from the stars. As the Deathworlder fleet ascended into the sky, leaving the ravaged planet below, a sense of calm settled over the Lyrians. Their world had been saved, but the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Yet in this moment, something had shifted. There was hope, a new kind of hope that the Lyrians hadn't felt in years. Commander Valen stood at the helm of the Wraith, looking down at the planet below. The surface was scared, but there was still life, still potential. He knew that this mission had been more than just stopping a weapon. It had been about teaching the Lyrians something they had forgotten: how to truly live in harmony with the world around them, how to adapt, and how to survive without relying too much on destructive technology. "Commander, we're ready to move out," said Lieutenant Cora, standing by Valen's side. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. They had done what they came to do, but leaving the Lyrians behind felt like leaving something unfinished. The work they'd started couldn't be completed in just a few days. Valen nodded, glancing at the planet one last time. "Let's go. We've done all we can." The fleet's ships began to move, their engines humming softly as they turned toward the stars. The Lyrians were left to rebuild, but they weren't alone. The lessons the Deathworlders had shared would stay with them, and the knowledge that they had made it through the worst would be their guide. Back on the surface, Rethin stood at the highest point of the ruined city, watching the ships fade into the distance. His people were already beginning to gather in the streets, starting the hard work of rebuilding their homes, their cities, and their future. It was going to take time, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, Rethin felt a spark of optimism. He thought back to the days when his people had been at the height of their power. The Lyrians had been proud, certain that their technology could protect them from anything. But they had been wrong. The weapon they had created to safeguard their world had nearly destroyed it. It was a sobering lesson, one that would shape their future. Rethan looked down at the cracked streets below him. They were still standing, still alive, and still capable of rebuilding. He thought about the Deathworlders, their strength and resolve, and how they had shown the Lyrians a new way to survive. "We'll rebuild," he whispered to himself, "but we will never forget." The days that followed were filled with the sounds of reconstruction. The Lyrians worked together, clearing debris, repairing buildings, and restoring what they could. The Deathworlders had left behind more than just knowledge. They had left behind a sense of resilience. The Lyrians had always relied on their technology to solve their problems, but now they knew that true survival came from understanding their world and themselves. Rethan had established a council to oversee the rebuilding efforts. It was a small but necessary step in creating a new structure, one that didn't revolve around a singular destructive force. They would need to rethink their society, their technology, and their place in the galaxy. And then, just as the city began to show signs of life again, a small delegation of Deathworlders returned. The Lyrians watched as the ships touched down once more, their engines quieting in the calm atmosphere. Rethan approached the group as they disembarked. Valen was at the front, flanked by a few of his soldiers. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement as Rethan walked toward him. "I thought you were leaving," Rethan said, a smile tugging at his lips. "What brings you back?" Valen's expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. "We didn't leave completely. We promised to teach you what we could. And we're not done yet. You'll need help to make sure that the technology you rebuild with will never again threaten your survival." Rethan's heart lifted. "You're willing to stay and guide us further?" Valen nodded. "For now, yes. We'll help you rebuild and offer what we can. But remember this, survival is not just about technology. It's about knowing when to use it and when to leave it behind. We can show you how to balance it." Rethan looked at his people, who had gathered around, listening closely. There was a sense of unity in the air, something that had been missing before. They had come together in their darkest hour, and they were ready to rebuild, not just their cities, but their way of life. "We're ready to learn," Rethan said, his voice strong. "We've learned from our mistakes, and we know that we must do things differently this time." Valen smiled, a rare sight on his usually stoic face. "Then let's get to work. You have a long road ahead of you, but we'll walk it together." The Deathworlders stayed on the Lyrian world for several more months, offering their knowledge and guidance. They taught the Lyrians how to build stronger, more sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with the planet's natural systems. They shared their understanding of resilience and survival, not just in terms of warfare, but in every aspect of life. Over time, the Lyrians began to rebuild their cities with care. They worked not only to restore what they had lost, but to create something better, something more balanced. It was a slow process, but the changes were visible. The once devastated world was beginning to recover. And though the Deathworlders would eventually leave, their influence would remain. The Lyrians would never forget the lessons they had learned from the stars. The lessons of survival, of resilience, and of the importance of balance in all things. Months passed, and the Lyrian world continued its steady recovery. The storms had subsided, the electromagnetic pulses faded into history, and the once ruined cities now began to show signs of life once again. The work was far from complete, but there was a renewed sense of purpose among the people. They were rebuilding, yes, but more importantly, they were rebuilding with wisdom, guided by the lessons the Deathworlders had left behind. Rethan stood at the edge of the newly restored city, overlooking the green fields that had once been scared by energy storms. The crops were starting to grow again, nourished by the careful balance the Lyrians had learned to strike with the land. The skies were clearer now, no longer clouded by the constant threat of destruction. The planet felt alive again, in every sense of the word. He had always been a leader, but now, more than ever, He felt the weight of responsibility. The world his people were rebuilding wasn't the one they had known. It was something new, a world where technology was used wisely, where nature and innovation worked together, not against each other. Rethan turned as footsteps approached from behind. It was Valen, along with a few of his team members. The Deathworlders had stayed far longer than anyone had expected, but now, the time had come for them to depart. The Lyrians had learned much in their presence, and it was clear that their guidance was no longer needed in the same way. "You've done well," Valen said, his voice calm but filled with a rare warmth. "This world is already showing what it's capable of. You've come a long way from where we first found you." Rethan smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. "We had help," he said. "Your lessons have made all the difference. We owe much of our survival to you." Valen nodded. "We didn't do it for you. We did it because you were ready to learn. You had the strength to accept the truth, something most civilizations struggle with. And that's why you're going to thrive." The two stood in silence for a moment, watching as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the restored land. The Lyrians were working in harmony with their environment now, using the knowledge the Deathworlders had shared to ensure their world would never face the same threat again. "You don't have to leave, you know," Rethan said quietly. "You could stay. Help us build even more. Help us. Guide us through the next steps." Valen's eyes softened. He had grown to respect the Lyrian people in ways he hadn't expected when he first landed on their world. But he knew that his people's role had always been one of a catalyst, not a permanent fixture. "No," Valen replied gently. "This is your world. It's your time now. The Deathworlders came to stop a disaster, not to take over. We've given you the tools, but it's up to you to use them. That's how it should be." Rethan nodded, understanding. He was proud of his people. They had not only survived, they had learned, adapted, and begun to thrive in a way they never could have before. As Valen turned to leave, Rethan stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We will never forget what you've done for us. Your actions have ensured a future for the Lyrians, a future that will be built on wisdom, not fear." Valen gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his eyes meeting Rethan's with a sense of quiet approval. "You're welcome, Rethan. Just remember, the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that preserves." And with that, the Deathworlders began to board their ships. The sky above, once filled with dark clouds and violent storms, now held only the calm, peaceful light of a new day. The fleet slowly ascended, and the Lyrians watched as the ships disappeared into the stars. Over the following years, the Lyrians continued their journey of rebuilding, no longer relying on their old weapons or destructive technologies. They embraced a new era of cooperation with their environment. The lessons they had learned were passed down to future generations, who grew up with a deep respect for both the power and the fragility of life. Rethan, now a wise elder, often found himself walking the same streets he had once patrolled as a young leader, but now they were full of children playing, families working, and communities growing. The once desolate city had become a vibrant symbol of their resilience. The Lyrians had found their balance. The Lyrian Council, guided by Rethan's steady leadership, now worked to ensure that technology would always be used with care. The Deathworlders had left, but their influence remained. Their teachings had become ingrained in the Lyrian way of life, a legacy that would never be forgotten. One day, as Rethan stood overlooking the city, now fully restored, he reflected on the journey they had taken. He thought of the Deathworlders, of their strength, their wisdom, and their quiet guidance. They had given the Lyrians not just the tools to survive, but the understanding to thrive. "They saved us," Rethan murmured, looking up at the sky where the Deathworlder fleet had once disappeared. And in that moment, he realized that the greatest gift wasn't just survival. It was the chance to build something better, something that would last. The Lyrians had found their way, and it was a way that would endure for generations to come. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with hope, hope that had been born from the stars, from the lessons of those who had come before. And that hope would continue to light their path, no matter where the journey took them.